Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Amsterdam and speak with Steve Keen, Professor Steve Keen, author of Debunking Economics. Steve, welcome back.
Good to be here, Max and Stacey.
All righty. You know, we got to talk about the Australian property market for reasons that will become apparent quite soon here. So the Australian property market, Sydney is down 10%. The impossible has happened. Is this just the beginning, or will the government and central bank come to the rescue once again, Steve Keen?
Well, I think it's been the world's longest pump and dump scheme, and the pump is now over and the dump is occurring. And it's the reason Australia managed to avoid tumbling into the global financial crisis in 2008 is fundamentally some good government policy, which was a huge stimulus. Actually done by one of the guys who's currently being grilled by the Royal Commission into Banking, Ken Henry, who was then Treasury Secretary, who advised the then Labor Party government led by Kevin Rudd to, quote-unquote, go hard, go early, go households. So they threw money at the household sector, and that's government money. Literally everybody with a pulse got $1,000 to spend, as what they call the tax rebate. But at the same time, they also restarted the housing bubble by doubling for existing houses and trebling for new houses, what they called the first home owners boost, and I called the first home vendors boost, because it went from giving us every new buyer from 7,000 Australian dollars, roughly 5,000 US, to 21,000 dollars Australian to buy a house. And in Victoria, if you bought a new house outside the metropolitan area, they gave you 35,000 Australian dollars. Here's cash, go buy a house. Well, guess that went to the house prices. Then, when that started to run out of steam, the central bank there, the Reserve Bank of Australia, cut interest rates quite dramatically and encouraged a whole lot of what they call investor housing. And then the so-called regulator, otherwise known as Ponzi Merchant Central, called the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, approved the development of what they called interest-only mortgages, which meant for 5 of the 25 years of a mortgage, you just paid the interest bill. For the next 20, you paid the interest plus principal. So when the switchover occurred, the amount of money you paid increased by 40%. Now, of course, you never did that because, of course, house prices always rise. So after 5 years, you flipped the house and you made a profit on the increase in the value of the house without ever having to pay into the principal of the loan off. Wonderful system. Nothing could ever go wrong. Well, and to make it easier still, the banks worked out your living expenses for you. So rather than you having to say what you actually spent, they calculated it for you. And the National Australia Bank has on the Royal Commission website, they have to call the living expenses calculator. And you'll be happy to know, Max, that if you and Stacey decided to have a kid, you'd be best to raise it in Sydney because it costs you a mere $7 a day to raise, educate, clothe, and otherwise process your baby.
That's great. Well, I'm a huge sperm donor in Australia, but I'm not sure I get a tax rebate for that. No, I'm only joking about that. But, you know, Steve, you're an economist. Let me ask you a question here. So people always talk about Venezuela as being an economic basket case because the Venezuelan government keeps just giving away money to everybody, and it seems like the socialism, the Venezuela doesn't work, and it's a failure. But what you're describing there is the government giving away money. So how is that different than Venezuela other than the fact that instead of giving away cash, they're essentially giving away houses?
Well, they're giving away houses, but as long as you borrowed money from the banks to buy them. And that led to Australian households going from being heavily levered, but not the worst on the planet, to the second worst household in terms of level of household debt to income and household debt to GDP, second worst on the planet behind Switzerland. And Switzerland, of course, runs a massive trade surplus, whereas Australia runs a trade deficit. And that makes a big difference because in terms of countries that run a trade deficit, the only country that compared to Australia was, wait for it, Ireland. And Ireland reached its record back in 2010, I think. It's since slumped to went from 60% of GDP as the household debt level to 120% during a so-called Celtic Tiger phase, back down to 60% as the bubble burst. Australia hit 122, 123% as the household level of ratio of household debt to GDP. So we're now the world record holders amongst countries running a trade deficit. And now it's all coming unstuck. Because the only way that whole thing worked was if more people jumped on the Ponzi escalator. And as you pointed out to begin this program, house prices in Sydney, which have been rising by 10, 20% per annum for some years, have now fallen by 10% in 1 year. And of course they're saying it's going to be a soft landing. Well, I'm afraid it's a soft landing like a Exocet missile hitting Baghdad.
Well, you know, markets go up the staircase and down the elevator shaft, as they famously say on Wall Street. And there is no soft landing. But, you know, when you talk about Ireland and you talk about 2008 and you talk about the housing bubble, it sounds like 2008. So the question is, are we basically just picking up where we left off in 2008 with all the global bank, central bank money printing having worn off at this point, and it didn't really do what they hoped it would do long term? And so did we ever leave the 2008 crisis, Steve?
It won't be a rerun of the 2008 crisis in the countries that actually had a crisis in 2008. The ones that are going to have a 2008 style crisis now are the ones that managed to jump over it, jump over the puddle in 2008 by leveraging up households even more. And that's fundamentally Australia and Canada, but also China, which levered up the entire private sector. To some extent, possibly Korea. I think France is looking like one that's done a large amount of corporate debt increase over the last 10 years. So there's a range of countries which managed to sidestep the crisis by continuing to borrow private money, private debt. The ones that actually did the crisis back in 2008, obviously the America, but also the UK, Spain, Ireland, quite a bit of Europe. Those countries are in what I call the walking dead of debt state. They had a debt-driven bubble back in 2008. It burst then. They've reduced the debt levels a bit, but nowhere near as much as they fell after the Great Depression and the Second World War. So they're carrying the ball and chain of debt around their ankles. They can't get much momentum up. Whenever they do, the central banks there, particularly the Fed, will believe, okay, we're back to normal days again, because they ignore the role of debt and credit in the economy. Start putting up interest rates, which they're doing now, of course, with another rise just recently. With that increase in service charges, people are going to start no longer wanting to borrow money from banks, and also trying to pay down their debt levels, and some of them go bankrupt under the debt levels they've currently got. That will mean they'll go back to deleveraging again, reducing private debt, meaning negative credit rather than the positive credit in the boom before the bust. And that will mean the growth will suddenly unexpectedly fall, and there'll be a need to reverse interest rate rises. And the central banks will go back from trying to cool an overheating economy to trying to stimulate a declining one. That's what I call turning Japanese. And that's the state I expect for the America in particular, the UK as well, Europe, with its added problems of the euro. So we're not going to have another 2008 crisis on a global scale, but we will have a number of isolated crises in countries that avoided it back in 2008, and stagnation like the Japanese have been through for the last quarter century in those that had the crisis back in 2008.
All right, so that's an interesting point there. So the ones that jumped over the crisis in 2008, Australia, Canada, China, Korea, and possibly France, are the ones in line to get clobbered this time. Let's focus on China for a second. You know, Australia has benefited enormously from the massive wealth creation that's happened in China. How do you see the trade war now between the U.S. and China unfolding in 2019?
You've got to start any comment on China by saying it's done an incredible transformation of its economy and its culture in the last 30 years. I was actually there in 81, 82 when I organised a conference between Australian and Chinese journalists just as Deng Xiaoping had taken over. We were literally there during the trial of the Gang of Four, and it was being broadcast on loudspeakers all through Beijing. And at that stage, it was a peasant economy, no other way to describe it. The standard of living was extremely low. The main smell you copped in the streets of Beijing was cabbage, because people were preserving cabbage for the winter. It was a primitive, advanced civilization culturally, but primitive economically. 30 years later, it's dramatically transformed. It's an industrial powerhouse. It's the production planet, country of the planet. Technological development occurring at a very high rate, a liberal culture to some extent with Big Brother sitting in the background, but that Big Brother is more responsive to what its people want than the countries that the West are, with the faux democracy we have in the West. So dramatic transformation, but they're a solution to when the global financial crisis hit, China's exports fell by about 40%. and you had a dramatic shifting of people from all the coastal cities where all the production and trade occurs back to the rural hinterland, because with the Chinese social security system, you were registered for a particular location. Most of the workers in the coastal fringes were converted peasants from the countryside. They had to go back to the countryside, and they were not happy, putting it mildly. There was talk of revolution, talk of breaking into warring states, like the 18 provinces that are China could go back to being 18 separate countries. So the Chinese Communist Party basically hit the massive, biggest stimulus they could. They told their banks, which are largely state-owned, state-controlled certainly, to lend to anybody with a pulse. The increase in private debt that year in 2010 in China was roughly 40% of GDP in 1 year, and they went from a debt level of about 120% of GDP, this is private debt, to about 200% in a matter of 5 or 6 years. It's the fastest rate of growth of private debt ever in history, 3 times faster than Japan or America during their bubbles. But what it meant was a huge stimulus. Now, of course, that's built all those empty cities we've been seeing for the last decade now. That's run out of steam. Those prices can't be sustained, they're falling over. But at the same time, the Chinese Communist Party has directed state-level finance to say, let's build the biggest infrastructure boom in history. So you have all the high-speed rail being drilled through China itself, which I'm looking forward to experiencing one day. The Silk Road initiative as well, which is building a conduit to Europe, with Chinese workers and Chinese firms and Chinese goods being built through the countries between China and Europe. So that is actually, from what I've seen, equivalent to something like about 15% of GDP of spending by the government. Now, put that in concert, that's 3 times the scale of the New Deal during the Great Depression, and 1.5 times the scale of the Obama stimulus in 2010. So that huge level of government spending is masking the collapse of the credit system.
Oh, fantastic, Steve. Nice talking with you again. Have a great new year. By the way, how can people contribute to you on Patreon?
Yeah, well, they can go to the website, www.patreon.com/Prof. Steve Keen, and sign up. The minimum sign-up is $1 a month. Maximum is a lot more than that if you want to be generous. My basic idea is to give an amount of money that won't make your spouse annoyed with you, and that can support my work and keep in touch with the research I'm doing to try to give us a decent economics.
Is there an amount of money that one can choose that won't make your spouse mad at you? That's an existential question for 2019. Thanks for being on the show, Steve.
Thank you.
That's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Professor Steve Keen. You can find him on Patreon. If you want to catch us on Twitter, it's Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.